In 1675, Robert Boyle was probably the best-known figure in the new society of experimental philosophy in London that had emerged since England's Charles II had assumed the throne of Great Britain following the Restoration. Originally from Ireland, Boyle had studied on the European continent, had joined the Invisible College, first at Gresham and then at Oxford, and had, along with a few of that group, gone to the Crown to request support for the founding of a new society, a Royal Society, devoted to the investigation of nature through the use and discussion of experimentation. He had made his name through a series of brilliant experiments and demonstrations using the newly developed air pump to create spaces inside of glass vessels that were evacuated of atmosphere. Key to this work were two of his young protégés and devotees, Robert Hooke and Christopher Wren, the former often being the only person who could get the cantankerous device to function properly. Boyle had also written an extremely influential book, The Skeptical Chemist, in 1661 that, more than any other book of its time in England, realized in action the exacting nature of the experimental philosophy put forward by Francis Bacon some 50 years earlier. In it, he distinguished, for the first time, between the ancient practice of alchemy and the newly emerging field of chemistry, and put forward a number of requirements for the proper practice of the latter. By 1675, however, Boyle had retired, for the most part, from public life. He had stopped attending meetings of the Royal Society, and had restricted the times he would receive visitors and well-wishers. Initially, this had been for reasons of declining health, but soon he wrote that there were other goals that he had in mind. In the time gained back from the hectic schedule of public appearances, he hoped to, quote, recruit his spirits, range his papers, and prepare some important chemical investigations which he proposed to leave as a kind of hermetic legacy to the studious disciples of that art, end quote. While he did not spell out what his investigations were to be, anyone within a particular community could read within the lines, and would have known that a hermetic legacy could only refer to one thing, the study and practice of alchemy. In 1675, practicing alchemy was illegal in Britain, at least if the goal was to pursue the multiplication of silver and gold as had been decreed by King Henry IV in the early 15th century. Like many monarchs of that and later ages, he had known that to overthrow a king, one would need money to pay a mercenary army, and if an alchemist could produce precious metals from base ones, he could conceivably rule any kingdom or kingdoms his armies might conquer. The penalty for practicing the forbidden arts of transmutation could be death, and so those who worked to investigate the secrets of nature often hid their activities and cloaked their communications behind aliases and pseudonyms and wrote in elaborate codes. Boyle, however, had separated himself from this tradition in one very important way. He brought the requirements of experimental philosophy, the careful and precise doing of experiments and making of observation, to the art of alchemy, and by doing so, set the conditions for its eventual rejection as a scientific endeavor. That rejection, however, was still many years in the future. In the year 1675, Boyle received a notable visitor, the Lucasian Chair of Mathematics from Cambridge's Trinity College. The man, Isaac Newton, had presented an entirely new hypothesis on the nature of light a few years earlier that had been based on a number of innovative and elegant experiments he had done. The ideas, though, were not without their detractors, and Newton had declined to attend meetings of the Royal Society after their publication. However, on this occasion, Newton had traveled to the great city, not to engage the gathered philosophers, but to seek out the one man who might participate with him in a dialogue related to their shared forbidden interest. Boyle entertained Newton, and the two men discussed the foundations of how to understand the work they were doing in terms of the basic nature of the universe and how it was established. Newton would leave this meeting with a renewed sense of enthusiasm to delve into these mysteries and would rededicate himself to his own alchemical studies, studies that would lead him to both reject the mechanical philosophy of Descartes and accept the possibility of forces that could reach across space to affect objects, an idea more common with the occult and arcane ideas of an age passing by than the one being born. Hello, and welcome to the Scientific Odyssey. The Scientific Odyssey is a many-part journey into the history and philosophy of science. My name is Chad Davies, and I'm the writer, host, and producer of the podcast, where we consider the ideas, processes, and results of over 2,500 years of scientific inquiry and discovery. Series 3, Finding Our Place. Episode 27.3, Isaac Newton, Magic and Heresy. In this episode of the Scientific Odyssey, we're going to spend some time exploring some things that are usually well outside of our focus on what is commonly thought, today at least, as science. This week, we're going to look at those aspects of Isaac Newton's intellectual activity related to his work in the ancient practice of alchemy, as well as his divergent views on Christian theology. Both of these will take us far from the usual fare of physical systems and testable hypotheses, but as they form an important and vital part of his life, as well as the majority of his intellectual output, we would be remiss if we didn't spend some time discussing them. Also, it is the opinion of many of Newton's biographers that not only does his work on these topics give us great insight into his character and intelligence, the ideas that he thought about, the things that he engaged with, may have had a significant influence on his work after 1680. Before we get started, though, there are a couple of other notes I should make. First, I don't plan to discuss alchemy as a practice in anything more than the most basic of ways. For those who would like to learn more, I might suggest Travis Dow's History of Alchemy podcast as an excellent way to become more familiar with its ins and outs. Second, a good bit of the content of this episode will center around Newton's changing religious beliefs, which involve a variant version of Christianity. To understand his views, it will be necessary to dig into this set of views and his reasons and justifications for believing them. Please understand that, as in all other religious discussions we've had in the podcast, I am in no way endorsing these ideas or claiming that they are true or valid. I present them instead as part of a historical discussion devoted to painting the fullest picture possible of Newton's thinking. Third, it should be noted that outside of a small circle of confidants, different in each subject, Newton's views and work in these matters were broadly unknown during his life. While his religious views would come to be known shortly after his death, his writings on alchemy would remain hidden for a variety of reasons until the economist Maynard Keynes gathered many of his works during the 1920s and 30s. In 1946, Keynes gave an influential lecture that recast Newton not as a cold, rational, mechanical scientist of the worldview he would eventually bequeath posterity, but rather as a man deeply enmeshed in the ideas and assumptions of the rapidly fading medieval age with its magicians and sorcerers. Since then, with Maynard's collected works, along with additional writings collected by an anonymous scholar and donated to Hebrew University, a much fuller and more nuanced picture of Newton has emerged, one that is profoundly complicated. In this episode, we will attempt to examine the most mystical, if I can be forgiven for using that word, part of the picture that is Isaac Newton. So a word about alchemy. The origins of the art of alchemy, and by art one should understand that word in the Aristotelian context of a practical type of knowledge acquired and honed through practice, i.e. techne. That is lost in the midst of time. However, we know what becomes alchemy in Latin or medieval Europe has its origins in the writings of Aristotle and his 4 elements and 4 qualities. To this was added the ideas of first Hellenistic thinkers and then the ideas of the Arabic Hakim, most notably Jabir bin Hayyan. These ideas would be transmitted to Europe through a variety of channels, with the first possibly being as early as the 11th century, and they would come as a mix of practical and spiritual or mystical practices and ideas. While alchemy seems a little more like superstition or pseudoscience to us now, it really did attempt to explain the various physical changes one saw in a variety of processes, things like transmutation, putrefaction, and purification. In a world filled with change, alchemy was one attempt to understand and use that change in a way that was beneficial. One of the key goals, though it was certainly not the only goal, was the creation of something known as the Philosopher's Stone, a substance that would facilitate the transmutation of various materials, most notably metals, from one type to another. However, it should be understood that the role and function of the stone, which, rather interestingly, wasn't always or necessarily thought to be an actual stone, but could actually be a liquid in some cases, was thought to have existed within a much broader framework of knowledge about the function of the universe. This would be the thing that Newton would seek out, even as he did from time to time focus his work on the puzzle of developing a formula for the substance of the Philosopher's Stone. In other words, as we'll talk about, Newton was more interested in the big picture, even as he sometimes focused on the specifics. We don't know when Newton first became attracted to alchemy in and of itself, but in hindsight it certainly seems that in his time as a schoolboy living in the apothecary shop there in Grantham, likely had something to do with planting the first seeds of his interest there. The first real evidence we have of a true interest in the more formal subject can likely be traced to about 1669, though could be earlier than that, when he recorded in one of his waste books that he purchased both a 6-volume work on the topic written by Lazarus Zetzner titled Theatrum Chemicum, and also 2 furnaces that would be set up eventually in a small shed that adjoined his chambers at Trinity. By the time he was elected Lucasian professor, it is likely that he had left formal mathematics behind, more or less, for a topic that captured more of his creative imagination. So why did he pursue alchemy with such fervor? Like so many other great scientific minds, Newton was searching for a single, unifying idea or principle that would explain all of creation, a grand unified theory, as it were. He believed that the Creator had not been complex or arbitrary in his forming of the cosmos, but, like any mathematician, had begun with the smallest set of things, in this case 1, and had developed everything from that. This Prisca sapiens, as Newton called it, had once been known to humanity, but had been lost. It only needed to be rediscovered for all of civilization to rise once again to the heights God had intended for it to achieve. In this, by the way, we clearly see that Newton was as much a throwback to the pre-Columbian medieval idea of there being nothing new to discover. Rather, in his mind, at least at times, the chief task of the philosopher was to relearn what had once been known in a better and higher civilization that had long since passed away. This set him apart from the new intellectual movement that had been emerging for the previous century and a half, and that was most presently ensconced in the Royal Society he would soon be elected a fellow of. This was not the only thing that separated him from the world he found himself in, but we'll talk about that more a little bit later. Newton at this time was an enigmatic and somewhat intimidating figure at Trinity. He was a trim and somewhat attractive man, unmarked by pox scars or other signs of injury or disease. His hair had turned prematurely gray, and falling long to his shoulders, combined with a strong nose and an equine frame, gave the impression of a man filled with great, almost unstoppable intensity, something not quite made of the English countryside from whence he sprang. He was, in the words of one, a bit otherworldly. He was also reclusive and isolated, remaining in his chambers for days at a time, taking meals haphazardly. When he dined with his fellows of the college, usually only on high holy days and other special occasions, he was often unkempt, hair uncombed, and thus he was left to his own thoughts, as it was known that he could be a bit touchy and difficult in conversation. When he left his chambers at other times, either to take short walks or to deliver his increasingly infrequent lectures, he rarely bothered to dress with care, as was remarked upon by one of his earliest chroniclers, who said that the other faculty at the college described him as walking with shoes down at the heel and stockings untied, the Renaissance equivalent of leaving the house in your PJs and flip-flops. In those times, his colleagues learned to not only give him a wide breadth on the gravel-covered pathways of the grounds of the university, but also to step around the figures he occasionally drew with his walking stick, as disturbing them, even days later, could provoke his wrath. He was a hypochondriac and feared catching a deadly disease, likely a holdover from the years of plague, and so was touch-phobic. To ward off unknown infection, he prophylactically drank a concoction made from turpentine, rose water, olive oil, beeswax, and a few other ingredients. Sounds pretty tasty, doesn't it? From these descriptions, one is likely to think of a sort of 17th century Sheldon Cooper from the sitcom Big Bang Theory. But for that analogy to work, one would have to think of one of those episodes where Sheldon is completely lost in solving a problem, has only one awkward roommate, John Wilkins, and a few subservient students to take care of him, and for that to go on day after day after day for many, many years. Not a very enjoyable sitcom, if you ask me. Added to this was the isolation and secrecy his work in alchemy required, and that gives you something of a picture of a man cut off from the world of human interaction except through letters. A life lived, sealed off hermetically from anything but the interior journey of his own intellectual pursuits. In order to hide his identity, when he did communicate with other alchemists via letter or manuscript, he adopted an anagram of the Latinized Isaacus Newtonus, Jehovah Sanctus Unus. In the small shed he constructed adjoining the wall of the college's chapel, the furnaces he had purchased cradled a fire that burned day and night, matching his own insatiable curiosity. For Newton, as for all alchemists, a spirit was thought to have animated nature. While Descartes proposed a mechanical hypothesis that held that matter was passive and inert, Newton began to see it as being alive and active, filled with a vitality, and moved and changed by something beyond the sterile collisions and vortices of the French philosopher. Over the next decade, Newton would explore and examine the various processes, chemical and biological, that transformed one thing into another. Processes like freezing and melting, calcination and distillation, sublimation and deposition in chemistry, and generation and decay or putrefaction as it was known, and fermentation and respiration in biology. In time, Newton refined his methods of experimentation and investigation until he became the preeminent alchemist in all of the British Isles, and perhaps all of Europe. Working from Boyle's skeptical chemist, Newton adopted the older man's emphasis on careful measurement and observation and took them to new levels of precision and accuracy. From these, he began to develop a model that would allow him to synthesize and contextualize all of the data that was accumulating. Early in his researches, he focused, as did many alchemists, on processes associated with metals, and it is as a part of these researches that he likely produced the bronze alloy that he used to fashion the mirror of his reflecting telescope. Additionally, as he carefully observed the patterns of crystal growth in these metals, it is possible that he first glimpsed a physical analogy of the radially directed lines of force in the star-like patterns of crystals of an antimony-based alloy that he called star regulus of antimony, as befitted the typical nomenclature of alchemy. This he communicated to Henry Oldenburg in a letter in 1672, indicating that he had made significant progress in developing both the chemical skills and the alchemical knowledge needed to undertake substantial research. However, to focus exclusively on this aspect of the work, the creation of a philosopher's stone, would be to neglect what was likely a larger part of his alchemical work. Newton saw all of nature as a living thing rather than as a machine, imbued with the Spirit of God, full of transformations and potential transformations. What he sought was the key element, the underlying substance that was the base, vital material from which the Creator had made all things. In time, he would come to the conclusion that this material was the ether of first Aristotle and then Descartes. Both men had been wrong about the true nature of this substance, Newton thought. Aristotle believing that it was relegated only to the celestial realms, and Descartes in assuming it served only a mechanical function. Nevertheless, he saw all of nature as being vitalized by it, often using language of sexual reproduction, generation coming from seed and copulation, and, interestingly, religious purification. In this, he was undoubtedly influenced by the writings of the early church fathers, most notably those of Alexandria and Syria. Through the ether, God breathed life into matter and enabled its many processes, and so it was that Newton's interest in alchemy intersected with his faith. Moreover, the action of the ether was cyclical in nature, giving rise to generation and being released through the various processes of decay. It circulated through the earth to give rise to all of the various physical processes and also throughout the cosmos. For Newton, ether was that single unifying thing that gave rise to all of the change one saw in the natural world. As a result of all of this, Newton created an indexed chemicus, a catalog of not only every alchemical reference from a body of literature spanning more than 1,000 years, but also a compilation of his work that focused on the specifics of measurement and process. It was a monumental compilation, and yes, a distillation of everything he had learned. When he went to visit with Boyle in 1675 as part of a larger mission we'll discuss shortly, he went as the older man's chemical and alchemical equal in every single way. While it is likely they had met previously as part of a clandestine meeting of alchemists, this encounter would set up a long correspondence that was intellectually engaging while starkly highlighting the differences between the two men. Boyle, scion of a wealthy and well-established family, had little to be concerned about if his work in the forbidden art of alchemy were discovered. He had much to fall back upon and thus wrote extensively of his chemical investigations in a way that left little doubt in the minds of those with some discernment that much of what he discussed had been part of a broader program of alchemical research. Newton, on the other hand, was reliant on a position at a university, something that could be taken away from him. He had no great family wealth or name to buffer a loss, and so he continued his work and communication in secret. He was fearful and paranoid that he would be discovered and his position and title would be stripped from him, casting him back to the farm and a life of ignoble anonymity. Even with this abundance of caution, it is clear that Newton's ethereal theory, if it may be called that, would form the foundation of much of his work after this time, as can be seen in the letter he wrote and had read to the Royal Society regarding the nature of light at about this time. If Newton was paranoid and secretive about his researchers, it was not just because of his alchemical research, however. Connected with that was another deviation from the societal norms that would have resulted from his expulsion from Cambridge and his exclusion from the broader scientific community of Britain, this time of a more theological nature. As 1675 approached, Newton was confronted with a bigger problem than that of keeping his work in alchemy secret. As a major fellow at Trinity and Lucasian Chair, he was required to take holy orders in the Church of England. Unfortunately, by 1674, this had become impossible for him to do, as his religious views had evolved from a very strict version of Anglican Trinitarianism to something much more heretical. Let me see if I can explain the broad brushstrokes of the issue. Here again, the point is to make you, the listener, aware of the basic issues, not to delve into the deep theological or historical fine points of the subject matter. As such, I'll be glossing over a number of details. Those who are interested are encouraged to seek out any number of excellent podcasts and iTunes U courses devoted to the early Christian church and its history, as a way of more fully understanding how things developed. So, in the years after the first century following Christ's birth, there arose something of a debate about the true nature of Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit. Throughout the 2nd and 3rd centuries, there were a number of theological disputes associated with just what the relationship of Christ was with God the Father, as well as with the Holy Spirit, and the role of each entity and how that all worked. While there were a number of positions taken by various theologians over time, things eventually boiled down to two broad theological camps by the 4th century. In one camp were those who believed that while there was only one God, that God manifested in three persons, each of the same essence and substance, and all three being co-eternal. These three persons were God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. This theological framework is known as Trinitarianism. The other position, named after an Alexandrian cleric by the name of Arius, held that before creation there was only God as a single person who, in the proper time, sent forth from himself first the Son and later the Spirit. While these other two were imbued with the power and properties of God the Father, they were created beings and not eternal. Some versions of this Arian expression of the Christian faith also held that while Jesus of Nazareth was a man, the Christ, that thing that had emanated from God, had come to rest on him until the time of his crucifixion, when it left the human being from Nazareth to return to the God from which it had come. By the 4th century, the Christian church was being torn apart by these debates, and when the Roman Emperor Constantine made Christianity the state religion of the Roman Empire, he declared that he wasn't going to have a church split and fractured over its most fundamental doctrine. As such, he called together a council of bishops in the Bithynian city of Nicaea to work out the dispute and set forth a statement of faith that all the adherents of the religion could ascribe to. This council, held in 325, would produce a confession of faith known as the Nicene Creed that would embrace the Trinitarian view of Christianity. This creed, by the way, is still proclaimed in Orthodox churches around the world and, with one important modification, in Catholic churches as well. While I won't go into all of the twists and turns of how this would happen, in the eastern half of the empire, this Trinitarian point of view would take hold and remain the predominant view. However, in the west, things were more complicated for a while, as many of the Germanic tribes that would eventually end up conquering there would have been previously converted to the Christian faith by those holding Arian views. Even though the Trinitarian version of the faith would eventually prevail, Arianism would remain more viable in the West once the Catholic Church established itself. Nevertheless, in the 17th century, all of the major denominations of Christianity, even as they disagreed on the method and nature of salvation, the number, role, and nature of sacraments, and the authority of scriptural interpretation, they all agreed on the Trinitarian understanding of God. Now, as a youth, Newton would have been taught the Trinitarian doctrine, and it is almost certain that he would have ascribed to it at least until his enrollment at Trinity. However, by 1674, it is clear that he no longer held this view. How he made his way from the Nicene Confession to what he would eventually espouse to be true is kind of difficult to piece together. One thing that would likely have been the case is that part of his religious education, as an undergraduate anyway at Trinity, he would have learned to know and argue against the positions of those who held divergent views, and so certain arguments against Arianism would have been part of that. However, that doesn't explain why he would have delved any deeper. While this is purely speculation on my part, I suspect it may have had to do with his reading of the Church Fathers as part of his self-education in alchemy, because the two of these things sort of go hand in hand. In the writings of men like Cyril, Basil, and Athanasius, there's a good deal of time spent talking about the processes of corruption and generation as spiritual kinds of things. It seems to me that Newton, as he studied these writings from an alchemical perspective, would have been more deeply drawn into their theological content, content that often revolved around issues of the Trinity. It is here that I think that there is a psychological aspect that now comes into play. Newton's father had died before his birth, leaving him to the whims of capricious fate, soon to be abandoned by his mother and his stepfather. For Newton, it seems likely that it would have been very difficult to espouse a God that would have allowed himself to have been killed, no matter how salvific that action may have been. Rather, it would have been more psychologically acceptable for God to have sent a created entity, this Christ, as Newton called it, to interact with the broken and sinful world and to die on its behalf on a Roman cross on a hill outside of Jerusalem. Whatever the case, it is clear that by the early 1670s, Newton had become a radical anti-Trinitarian. There is some debate as to whether or not he was what one might call a true Arian. While some biographers ascribe that title to him, others aren't so sure and are instead more comfortable with the term Unitarian. What seems to be clear is that Newton's theological ideas, once they are untethered from the doctrines of either Anglicanism or Calvinism, are free to evolve and change over time. From my perspective, it is probably correct to think of Newton as a very committed pseudo-Arian who rejected the decision of the Council of Nicaea and who felt that the Church had corrupted the meaning of the Scriptures and had inserted additional materials into it in order to bolster their more, or at least their somewhat incorrect, theological position. This perspective dovetailed with a strong anti-Catholic bias that Newton likely developed during the years of the Protectorate. For the rest of his life, Newton would write extensively and at times obsessively on matters of theology, prophecy, and biblical interpretation. Among the most important topics of his writing was in the interpreting of the last book of the Christian New Testament, the Apocalypse, or Revelation as it is known today, in reference to the Greek name of the book and its allusion to removing or taking away of a veil. While much of the early interpretive tradition of the text of that work had been either spiritual or metaphorical, after the start of the Reformation, there had been new approaches that attempted to understand the various signs, seals, horns, vials, etc., and beasts especially, in historical terms. Key to this was the idea that the underlying theme of the book was a great battle between good and evil that had begun not with the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem or with the birth of Christ, but instead with the adoption of Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century CE. Newton would adopt this view, but would go far beyond the generally held Protestant position that claimed that the Catholic Church was the beast or Antichrist or Whore of Babylon. Instead, he thought it was actually the whole Trinitarian doctrine adopted in Nicaea and held by all Christian denominations of his time that represented that. Surely the Catholic Church had been the prime agent in that era, but it was that the doctrine itself was false, not just a specific institution that promoted it. It should also be noted that for Newton, Trinitarianism was more than just an error in doctrine. It was a sin. To worship the figure of Jesus of Nazareth as if he were the one true God was to participate in idolatry, the worst of all sins. In his writings on the subject, Newton would burn with rage against those who had in the past or in the present espoused this doctrine. In his writing on religion, Newton felt that there were a limited set of rules, again mimicking the mathematical axioms he was so familiar with, that should guide all attempts to understand prophecy. This approach makes it clear that Newton saw Scripture, especially the Old Testament and its long prophetic books, as sort of an elaborate Bible code cipher that, if it could be decoded, would lead one to a deeper, a more profound truth God revealed to just a chosen few. In his growing anti-Trinitarianism, Newton came to feel as if he had been called to be one of those chosen. What should be understood here is that at no time did Newton believe in God as just a matter of civic or academic obligation. He believed in God because he saw God as the fundamental part of nature, a living and active being who held sway over all things, omniscient and omnipotent, and not subject to death or corruption. For Newton, God both made up and filled all of space, even that which was empty. This belief would form the basis for his conceptualization of absolute space and time that would be so important to his realization of physics, in contrast to the philosophical ideas of men like Augustine, who had a very different idea about past, present, and future. As Newton wrote, quote, "He," meaning God, "is omnipotent, not only virtually, but also substantially. In him all things are contained and move, but he does not act on them, or they on him. He is always and everywhere. He is all eye, all ear, all brain, all arm, all force of sensing and of acting." End quote. In other words, Newton was a deeply spiritual man, strongly wedded to his beliefs, but those beliefs were not those of the institution he worked for. It should be also emphasized that Newton was not a deist, as many Enlightenment figures would end up being. He was profoundly convinced in God's active hand in the ongoing working out of things in the creation, something over which he would enter into a great debate later in his life. As 1675 approached, it became clear that Trinity College was going to require that Newton take holy orders and swear a confession that he no longer believed in. It was to be the 7th year of his occupancy of the Lucasian chair, and in something akin to tenure in today's universities, the taking of holy orders meant that the position would be his, barring some heinous offense, for the remainder of his life if he wanted it. However, while he was willing to hide his views on religion from those not chosen, he was not willing to proclaim something he saw as false. As such, he began to prepare to leave Cambridge. This is where a small network of friends, many of whom were now in high places in the British government with just a bit of influence, came to his rescue. Foremost among these was likely John Barrow, his predecessor as Lucasian chair. These men convinced the administration of Cambridge, and indeed the British Crown, that as the chair was one devoted to the study of mathematics rather than anything having to do with the broader topics of philosophy or theology, it should be exempt from the taking of holy orders and have the oath just be to uphold the standards of the university and support the British Crown. Now, some commentators have viewed this as a removal of the religious requirement from the position. But I think that a better way to think of it would be as a sort of religious don't ask, don't tell policy. As long as Newton was willing to keep his religious beliefs to himself and not espouse or teach them to a wider audience, no one would go around poking in his business. However, as Newton's successor would eventually find out, if one were to publicly declare such heretical beliefs, then the university and the college named after the very doctrine Newton disputed would have no choice but to dismiss the heretic. With this accommodation reached, Newton traveled to London in 1675 to take the new oath, be permanently invested to his chair at Cambridge, and meet with Robert Boyle and other members of the Royal Society. With this new security, Newton would bring forth a wealth of new writing, some to be shared with a broader audience, the rest to remain with him alone. Over the next decade, theology and alchemy would consume most of his time. From 1675 to 1685, Newton would write and rewrite an exposition on the apocalypse, bringing to bear his full historical approach. He would also expand his ideas and work on alchemy, and in time, the two subjects would almost become one and the same, a pursuit to fully understand God's creation and how the Creator worked through it in all things. When, in time, his thoughts turned back to first motion and later optics, this viewpoint would suffuse that work as well, leading him to create a full and complete system of understanding in each case. That work, however, was still a few years off. In 1679, Newton, buried in his isolation at Cambridge, received word that his mother had taken ill. He left the university and traveled to Lincolnshire, where he tended to her as her condition worsened. In June of that year, she died, and as her eldest son, he executed her will and set her affairs in order. Over the course of the 6 months it took to do that, as he worked away each day on his theological ideas, one has to wonder what thoughts of mortality went through his mind. Other than a few manuscripts and letters on mathematics, and a series of papers on optics that he kind of regretted, What did he really have to show for his life? Yes, he had a vast library, but not long before he had left Cambridge, much of his laboratory and many of his notes had been destroyed by a fire that had begun when he had left his furnace to burn in order to attend a service at the chapel. Only his proximity to the actual furnace itself had kept things from being worse. And so, what did he have to show for the last decade of his life? Upon his return to Cambridge in November, he found waiting for him there a letter from his old adversary, Robert Hooke. In it was a plea for anything that he might be able to publish in the Philosophical Transactions. Also, near the end of the letter, Hooke asked if Newton might have ever considered the problem of the motion of a ball dropped from a tall tower. As we bring this episode to a close, let me once again say that I've only scratched the surface of this aspect of Newton's life and intellectual work. More than 3/4 of the books he owned were devoted to these topics, and a roughly equivalent percentage of his writings discusses these subjects. If you are interested in learning more, I would recommend Rob Illiff's biography in the Oxford's Very Short Introduction series, which is especially good in understanding his theological work, and also Michael White's Isaac Newton, the Last Sorcerer, in reference to a good introductory discussion of alchemy and Newton's work therein. So, with a few notes about my research sources out of the way, let me shift gears here just a bit. In the coming weeks, we'll have something of a break in the production schedule. February 18th through the 21st is the winter meeting of the American Association of Physics Teachers, and for the first time in quite a while, I have the chance to attend as it is being held near me here in Atlanta, Georgia. As such, I'll be attending various workshops and sessions devoted to talking about best practices and the most current research on teaching physics, as well as discussing a variety of issues surrounding physics education in general. If you happen to be attending the meeting and have a chance, please take a moment to introduce yourself, as I'd love to meet you, assuming that I haven't already done that. The other thing is, it's been some 27 or so weeks since I've actually taken a break from the production schedule. As you might imagine, the grind of researching, writing, and recording week in and week out has begun to wear on me a bit, and so I think a little bit of a respite is in order before I burn out completely. I love doing the podcast, but there comes a point where you just need a break from worrying about whether you've done enough for the day to make sure that something's going to be ready to put out on Sunday. Therefore, I'm planning to not put out a show next weekend, and then, if all goes as planned, resume regular production after that with an episode on Newton's Principia and optics. Between now and then, you might find it enjoyable to go back and re-listen to our episodes on a brief history of the philosophy of time. Besides discussing the origins of the modern clock and calendar, we take a look at the development of the philosophy of time, including the central place Newton's work will have in that. Also, if you haven't subscribed to the podcast, you should do so that you won't ever have to worry about missing an episode. And if you have an extra minute, spread the word about the show. We're up to about 1,000 members of the crew, if the download stats can be trusted, and we'd love to see our community continue to grow. We may be kind of a niche show, but we're exploring some pretty exciting horizons, and we'd really love to have a whole lot more people be a part of that. Also, for everyone who's taken the time to write a review for the podcast, let me say thanks. You all are so very kind in your praise of my effort, and I really do appreciate it. It's a privilege to navigate for such a great group of folks. Anyways, wish me luck as I participate in the conference, and have a good couple of weeks. Until next time, full sails on your journey.